Hello, everyone. This is David Nicholson, and this is my presentation for September 7th. Unable to attend lecture, so I'm uploading this to the course website and for everyone to view. This is a review of the skills approach, which is found in Chapter 3 of Northouse. So I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about the early ideas by Robert L. Katz that framed the skills approach, and then discuss more recent researchers that have applied some empirical study to this topic. As we move forward through the course, I did want to just keep this definition that I posted last week in my lecture as well out there, which is the one that comes from Northouse, and that is leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. Inherent in this definition is the idea that leaders and followers influence each other so that the focus is not entirely on the leader when we're trying to understand effective leadership. There is a role to play, of course, by those who are working with the leader to achieve a common goal, and that's something that we want to keep in mind as we move through these different approaches, because they do differ in how they focus on the leader and the process and the leader's influence within the follower community. So let's just keep that in mind, and keep this definition in front of you. So I put this slide together before we get into the skills approach as a means to help you understand how we might conceptualize leadership based on the theories from the textbook. So the Northouse textbook, on the left side in the vertical column, you see different leader to group process, personality, perspective, acts and behaviors. These are different ways of conceptualizing leadership. And they all correspond in one way or another to the approaches that are framed and discussed in the textbook. And when you are thinking about how to construct your own personal framework for leadership, some kind of a schema like this might be helpful. I find that when you put things in tables or organize ideas in this way, you can begin to see things a little more clearly, and then it also helps you to compare and contrast between different approaches, so that, for example, as we move through the course, I'll be adding other approaches, of course, but we see that there's some differences between the trait approach and the skill approach in terms of where they focus their attention. A skill approach focuses on the leader. Trait approach focuses on the leader as well, but within the personality of the leader. So there is within the skill approach at least a some type of a process taking place, and that begins with the leader. And then as we go into the behavioral approach, we'll see a different domain of conceptualizing leadership, power relationships, and transformational processes and things like that. Now, the transformational process, of course, I highlighted that in green. It's a good bet that the Northouse definition of leadership falls within this transformational process. So if we had another checkbox for that, then we would put the check there for the Northouse definition. But I wanted, of course, there's other terms and that come up within the textbook that you can use in a table like this to kind of do a compare and contrast against different approaches or against different things that they bring up. So it's just a helpful way to think about things. So let's move into the skills approach. Now, the skills approach has some mid 20th century formulations with Robert Katz, who wrote in the Harvard Business Review Skills of an Effective Leader. And what you notice here is, and it's kind of intuitive when you look at it. He has mapped out skills according to management levels, right? So top management doesn't necessarily have to have high technical skills, but they have to be strong in human skills and conceptual skills. And conceptual skills we can imagine being things like strategic planning, and human skills might have to do with negotiation capabilities and things of that nature. Interestingly, when you get into middle management, there seems to be a need for all three of these skills in equal portions. So that's also something to consider here. Then we get into the supervisory management role, and we see that obviously you need technical skills, and you do need human skills, but the conceptual skills for long-term strategic planning might not necessarily be necessary at that level. I should mention that the human skills that we see here are also just thinking in terms of just people skills, very much to the degree that we can work with our colleagues, we can work with our peers to ensure that we're collaborating towards a common end. And the conceptual skills again are working with ideas and developing visions and probably understanding more about the long-term nature of certain things. So that is good to keep in mind. It's also good to keep in mind that this is the work of Robert L. Katz in the 50s, and it more or less sets a framework up for what other researchers will do later in terms of analyzing how these skills work in an organization or within an institution. So when we look at Mumford, Zuccaro, and Harding, we see that they are beginning to they base their research on examining the military, which is interesting. They did work on officers, and I think from the second lieutenant forward, and it was done in the early 1990s, according to your textbook, and it was a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense. So there was about 1,800 Army officers representing 6 different grade levels, and that explains why you see a picture of an Army officer here. But they and what's also interesting to keep in mind here is the type of sample that they're using, which I do believe the textbook brings up at some point, which is the fact that whatever their outcomes are and their conclusions are, we do have to ask, is this, are their outcomes and the conclusions able to be universalized to other institutions outside of the U.S. military or the U.S. Army in particular? So that's something to keep in mind whenever you see research that's done on a particular sample, and it says, oh, we did this study and we found that this group of people behaves in a certain way in a certain context. Well, okay, that's interesting, But what is more important than to ask is, who was a part of your sample survey, and how universal, how can we universalize this to ensure that there is actually something here, or is this conclusion something that is specific to a context, that your conclusions are not universal, cannot be universalized. And this happens many times in research, that when people don't think about these things, or when people read research without actually understanding what the research is trying to say in terms of its contextual setting. So I want to just focus on that a little bit here, because you know this is the part where we see conclusions are drawn from research uh, in everyday life, but we're not taking into consideration who was included in the survey, who was included in the sample, how big the sample was, etc. So Mumford, Zuccaro, and Harding did a very good case study here, which is 1,800 officers, and they have the conclusions that they came up with are modeled here in this table that you find in the textbook. And the key area is the competencies, or skills, problem solving skills, social judgment skills, and knowledge. It's an extremely interesting model, particularly when you get into asking more questions about these skills, and where they're needed at a particular leadership level. So their conclusion is that if you have these types of skills, the leadership outcomes will improve. You'll have effective problem solving and effective performance. I do want to discuss a little bit. I have some examples of what I envision that these competencies might include in terms of real life examples. They're not, as always, things aren't, these types of examples aren't always perfect, but it's at least a first attempt, and we can, in our discussion boards, we can talk more about this to see if we can come up with other examples of people who exhibit these skills, but more importantly, also how in our own observations, how does this intuitively feel, or how do our own intuitive observations form sort of a very loose empirical understanding of whether or not this is actually the case. So I think that's something that we have to think about too. Let's talk about problem solving skills, and just what that means. These are leaders, according to the text, creative ability to solve new and unusual, ill-defined organizational problems. So that's interesting, right? So you have to be good at problem solving, especially when these problems are really challenges that might be unforeseen. You have to be able to adapt and overcome, and this is something that is built into the DNA of officers in the military. Whether you're talking, it really doesn't matter what branch. They are taught that they need to understand that challenges will always be a fluid thing within their experience in the military, and quite frankly, that's true in life as well. But when you're in the military, they're trying to prepare you for crisis or war. So of course, in these scenarios, things change all the time, and your problem-solving skills have to be finely tuned in order to keep your cool under pressure, and to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, I don't want to keep everything on the military, because when I'm thinking about these skills, I'm trying to see if these competencies that we see framed here, I'm trying to find out whether or not they don't apply to other people, or I can't think of other historical examples where we would see these types of things. And the one that I did come up with for problem solving skills was Sir Henry Ernest Shackleton, who was in charge of the Endurance expedition. So just I wanted to talk a little bit about Ernest Shackleton for those who are not familiar with him, and that is you can find, I'm sure, a documentary on the Endurance voyage. He was a British polar explorer in the early part of the 20th century. The Endurance went out on an Antarctic mission, but it became lodged within ice. What ensued from that point was a several months of trying to get back to safe land. The first problem was they were waiting for the ice to break, but then the ice started to break the ship, and they started taking on water, so they had to abandon ship and go on to an ice floe and make camp. Now at this point, they were waiting to see if they were going to be able to make it some other way to safe land. It was concluded that the best thing to do at some point was for Shackleton to put some of his men in lifeboats and make a run for it, and see if they could, once the ice broke a little bit, and then the remainder of the men would stay on the ice floe and wait for help to come. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the men waiting for, watching everyone get in the lifeboats as Shackleton leaves you on an ice floe in ice cold water. I mean, you've already been there for probably a few months, stuck, whether it was on the boat or on the ice floe, and now your leader is leaving, promising to come back. Well, he did come back. And the outcome was no one lost their life in this what normally would have been a tragic situation, because everyone would have perished, if things had gone in other directions. It is a story of survival. It's a story of problem-solving skills. You have to think about what Shackleton had to manage in this particular case. That is not only his men, but how to deal with supplies, how to deal with the cold, and how to start to think about what's the best way to get back to land for everyone to get back safely. So it was a very there are books on this. There is I'm sure a documentary out there as well. That you can find. It's considered today one of the great stories of survival, and it's also considered to be, from a Shackleton standpoint, someone that shows leadership under pressure, and exhibited some very good problem-solving skills. So you want to keep that in mind. This is not a military example, but it is an example where you're facing a very fluid condition, and I mean fluid in a figurative and literal sense, because you also have these ice flows, and you have a lot of things that are going on that are very dangerous. But you have to keep the outcome in view, and that is getting everyone home safely. So I started thinking about social judgment skills, and social judgment skills, of course, are the ability to work with others, also the ability to have the social perspectives and flexibility when you're understanding group dynamics. So it's not just understanding how to work with someone on a one-to-one basis, but it's also understanding what makes the people around you tick, the ones that are following you, and how to inspire them, and how to get them motivated to as individuals and then as a group. So it's social judgment skills, I think, are very complex, in that you have to have a feel for how to, as a leader, you have to understand how your ideas will fit with other people, and also how other people work with each other. So it's and I think that one of the people that exhibited social judgment skills. I don't particularly know of John Wooden's career myself, but I did some reading on him, and he was a coach for UCLA in college basketball, I believe in the 60s and maybe early 70s. And he won 10 national championships in a 12-year period, which is a feat that's it's never been repeated. Also, he's won numerous awards, Coach of the Year, and his leadership style and his integrity as a leader, and his and the comments from players that have worked with him through the years have all been very positive. He seems to have been a strong leader in many ways in terms of character as well. But the social judgment skills come into play here because when you think about it, you're trying to motivate these young men to do something, and they all come from different backgrounds, and they're in they want to win basketball games, but there are group dynamics to consider, not just how they relate to you as a coach, which might be a little, which might not be too hard to perceive, but also how they relate to each other as players and teammates. So you have to understand the group dynamics, and you have to be able to put the right team on the court in order to achieve the wins that you're trying to accumulate. So I think John Wooden would be a good example of someone who exhibited in his life or in his career as a coach some social judgment skills. Now, I struggled with the next one a little bit in the sense that knowledge. I was trying to I was trying to find someone who best exemplified, what it means to be a leader with knowledge, and I came up with Otto von Bismarck, who was the foreign minister of Prussia in the late 19th century, and then became Chancellor of Germany after he had largely single-handedly unified Germany. Now, Bismarck is known for his skills in diplomacy, foreign relations, and the various things that he achieved as foreign minister and chancellor of Germany. And so there was great admiration of him regarding what he was able to do. There is one catch to his knowledge, and that is that he set up a system, some historians argue, whereby no one with any less knowledge was able to carry on without him. So, but in order to navigate the intricate halls of power in Europe in this period was very difficult, to put it mildly. But Bismarck set up a variety of alliances, and he did help, as I mentioned. He was largely responsible for the unification of Germany in the 19th century, because it was not unified at that point. And that's why he was the Prussian foreign minister first, before he became Chancellor of Germany. So this would be an example of someone who has a lot of knowledge about a very specific set of circumstances, and he is able to achieve, for the most part, the outcomes that he wants. Now, as with anything in foreign policy, there are some people who are more ambivalent about what he achieved. But I don't think anybody would doubt his skills as a diplomat or a chancellor, because he was very strong in these areas. It's just that once he left the scene, shortly thereafter, things kind of fell apart in terms of these alliances, as we know from the First World War. But anyway, that's my idea for for someone who might be representative of knowledge in terms of a high leadership position. So these are the skills then from the competencies that Zaccaro, Mumford, and others have designated, and we can begin to think about how our own observations would either confirm or disconfirm these areas. Going into the strengths of the skills approach, you can review some of these things in the text, but it is leadership focused. One of the virtues is that it's available to everyone, and this is something that, going back to what we talked about in Plato, skills can be learned. So in this type of it is structured for training because people can have classes that hone some of these skills and make them ostensibly better leaders. There are it's an expansive view in that there are many different little components to it, as we saw from that graph earlier. That might actually end up being a weakness, but that's of course something to keep debating. This is the critiques of the system here, and what we see is some of the many skills that are mentioned here might actually be beyond leadership. They mention a couple. I think one is negotiation, and it's not clear that that's a skill that's necessary for every leader. It describes how leadership functions, but it doesn't explain very well how to get there. It's a little ambiguous, I guess, is what they're trying to say here with this critique. Some individual elements are actually trait-like. If you notice the sort of table that we looked at earlier, where they talk about the attributes of the individual into the competencies and things like that. So the use of the military population does raise questions of generalization to other leadership settings, which I mentioned earlier. So this is the skills approach in short, and if you have some questions about it, please feel free to email me or anything on this particular mini lecture. But also start thinking about who, first of all, do these competencies make sense to you? And second of all, do you have examples? And also how we might be able to better empirically understand or test these models. I think that's something that we have to also think about in the semester, is if we were going to test a particular model, how might we do it? What types of leaders might we look at? What types of a institution or organization would be? Some institutions may be better positioned to highlight a particular competency than others, for example. Or we can mix and match, populations of people to see how where we can universalize some of these traits or some of these skills. So that's it for this particular presentation, and I will post something on the discussion board that we can discuss related to this topic. Thank you.